Welcome back to another episode of Divorce at Altitude. This is Ryan Calamea, and I am joined by my esteemed co-host, Amy. What's new, Amy? What are we going to talk about today?
It's all over the news. I know everyone is talking about it. We're talking about the Costner divorce. It's really interesting because it has some interesting legal issues, and we're going to be specifically talking about the premarital agreement and why it's getting contested and maybe some, things that you can do to either enforce it or to deal with, like discovery issues. So
Yeah, and for listeners, Kevin Costner, he does have a house in Aspen. It's a beautiful property. I drove past it just a couple days ago. Most people know, and he was kind of photographed in Aspen during the summer when we're recording this, but we're not involved. It's a California divorce. There's some issues in California, but Amy, I see just some headlines. I know my wife, she really likes this kind of news, and it has been all over the place. I think it's unfortunate that we're even talking about, this issue and that it's all over the news to begin with.
yeah, I mean, I think when you look at, celebrities involved in divorce, it just brings another, complexity, to the situation. So I think it's just one of those things where I think as divorce attorneys and also people who are listening, we can learn, from those divorces that are semi, pretty much public. We can learn a lot, from them as well.
Yeah, well, we've had various episodes previously about arbitration, about private judges and keeping things confidential. We'll get into things with the Kevin Costner divorce, but Amy, for those that maybe don't know about what the issue is, or just to kind of set the stage, if listeners are hearing this and it's been kind of resolved and no longer applicable, just to lay the groundwork. What are we talking about, or what are the issues involved in the Kevin Costner premarital agreement challenge and divorce in California?
Yeah, so I'll back up and just, you're always looking at from when I'm meeting someone, I want to know the statistics of the marriage. So for those of you that don't know, Kevin Costner has been married for 18 years. He has 3 children with his now second wife. It's obviously a very high profile case. There have been some issues related to even, child support. And where it all hinged was the parties meeting Kevin and his soon to be wife, Christine. They signed a premarital agreement in 2004, right before they got married. And essentially what that prenup said that was that upon divorce, Christine would get 1.5 million as a payout. And so when they chose to part ways, she would not leave the, marital residence when she was supposed to. That was one of the provisions within the premarital agreement. Costner believes that the premarital agreement is ironclad and should be, upheld and is enforceable. So that's the main, issue that going on right now is that Christine is contesting the validity and the enforceability of the prenup that they signed in 2004.
Yeah, and we don't know what the financial disclosures were at the time, but in 2004, Kevin Costner was a movie star. He had done Field of Dreams, he had done Dances with Wolves, and so understandably so, he wanted to protect himself. He had gone through divorce, and so before, and there was a premarital agreement, and so then, there's this payout. We'll talk about, that. We don't know the ins and the outs, but it's been reported that Kevin Costner is now worth $400 million because there's the Yellowstone and some other various media and entertainment businesses that he's been involved with, but he's worth a lot more now than he was at the time of the divorce or at the time of the marriage. And so, she understandably is saying, well, I want more money, but he's also understandably, if you take his perspective, we signed an agreement of $1.5 million. Just so people understand, Amy, you mentioned child support. Why didn't they deal with child support in the premarital agreement, or can't you have, an agreement on child support?
So you cannot have an agreement on child support. So you cannot have an agreement on parenting time. They're also, having a battle over, the parenting time for the children, even though the children are a little bit older. I think they're 13, 15, and 16. But yes, it's against public policy to contract around parenting time, decision making, and child support in a premarital agreement.
And I'm nearly certain that is a universal tenet for California, Massachusetts, across the country. That each state has their differences. We've talked a little bit about that. And so, but my understanding is, at least according to the news, is that Kevin Costner has been ordered to pay somewhere in excess of $100,000 per month in child support during temporary. So as we record this, they're about to have a hearing on the validity unless they settle it. So, Amy, can you maybe talk about the validity of premarital agreements and then guide our listeners through what is discovery and what are the attorneys and the parties really focused on right now as we record this when there's a dispute over a premarital agreement? I think that will be helpful for listeners to understand because there was, some news reports when we recorded this about them doing a deposition and maybe put that into context for everyone that may be interested.
Yeah, so there's definitely discovery issues going on right now. And that hinges around the fact that when you have a premarital agreement, there has to be a fair and full and fair financial disclosure at the time or before you enter the premarital agreement. So essentially, the wife is arguing that there was not adequate financial disclosures, at the time of entering the premarital agreement in 2004. And so her attorneys are seeking documents from Kevin, such as bank statements for years and years, going back to look at what it was his financial situation actually like at the time of signing the premarital agreement. And if it was, if he failed to disclose something or it was significantly different, that could raise a question as to the validity or the enforceability of the premarital agreement that Kevin and Christine entered.
Right. And then I think there's another argument. So there's the disclosure argument, but then there's also reportedly, and this is very common, these arguments, they are fairly universal in challenges to premarital agreements. And for listeners, what we're going to do is we'll talk about what are the things that Kevin Costner and his attorney, Laura Wasser, the kind of Hollywood divorce queen, what issues or kind of questions or things that they're going to be concerned about or doing, and then what are the things that Christine Baumgartner, that her attorneys are going to be really focusing on. But Christine also is making this, Kevin Costner's wife is saying that she felt pressured to sign the agreement and that she didn't understand what she was signing. So can you maybe comment a little bit more on that, Amy, to put it into context of what we're talking about?
Yeah. So, I mean, essentially, she was saying that there was undue influence and possibly coercion at the time of the signing. However, both parties, I presume, I haven't seen the premarital agreement, were represented by counsel. In Colorado, there's case law that says that just because you sign a premarital agreement the day before a wedding, that doesn't mean that you were forced to do that. And the reason is because you could choose not to get married. So those arguments are, really hard. But if you're Christine's lawyer, you're going to be interviewing everyone that was at the wedding. You're going to be interviewing everyone that, like her family members coming up to the signing to figure out, what was the state of mind. You're going to be looking for, was there a video of the actual signing? So those types of things. If you're Kevin's attorney, you're going to be also probably interviewing those same type of people, but it is it's definitely a harder, argument to make.
Well, yeah. And one of the things in the law is that there's these things called burdens of proof. And so it's a matter of, okay, so you have this written agreement. And in the Kevin Costner divorce, there's clearly a signed agreement. But then you get into, well, is the starting point that agreement is valid? And then the Christine Baumgartner, Kevin Costner's wife, has to prove that it's invalid, or does Kevin Costner have to prove that it's valid? And California, I think, has some burden shifting. It's kind of weird that the one has to make a prima facie case. So, Kevin Costner says there's an agreement, it was entered in voluntarily, and then it shifts. So in Colorado, the person challenging an agreement, a marital or premarital agreement, they have the burden to prove in essence that there was no financial disclosure or that they were forced into it. And you have to have a voluntary agreement. And, really, Amy, in my experience is that there's often it's more common for parties to argue what the agreement actually means or says and argue over the terms as opposed to whether it's valid or invalid. But when you get into these arguments about whether it's valid or invalid, often what will happen is the Kevin Costner's attorney will send interrogatories, so questions, and this has been kind of leaked in the news. One can only assume that this is Baumgartner's because, like, she's just trying to pressure through public support because Kevin Costner is a public figure, and so they feel like there's some sort of advantage where Kevin Costner is like, I'll pay you off. I'll pay you more than the 1.5 just to make this news so that people like Ryan and Amy aren't talking about it and other people. But there's been some leakage about that she's refusing to acknowledge or say exactly what her contentions are. There's been these kind of vague innuendos, but really what we would do is Kevin Costner on his end, he would say, that he would ask her, tell me, when did you first learn about the Kevin Costner wanted to have a premarital agreement? Did you guys talk about this when you guys got engaged? And really get specific about the terms and the timing and all of that. And, did you disclose your financial circumstances and really get into the nuts and bolts and unpack the negotiation. And critical to that is because Christine Baumgartner, she's going to have to waive her attorney client privilege because she's challenging it. And if she did have an attorney and she didn't understand it, then Kevin Costner, understandably or rightfully, is going to say, well, how often did you talk to your attorney? And there's going to have to be a disclosure of the billing statements and the notes. And so, Amy, can you maybe talk about how important or why those attorney files are going to be exchanged and what relevance that would be in the discovery phase of a challenge to a premarital agreement?
Yeah, so that would be very important in the discovery phase because let's talk about the financial disclosure. So within the attorney's file, you're going to be able to see what financial disclosure actually was made on each side. So that's going to help in the determination to see was there fair disclosure. The other thing that you're going to find is drafts of the premarital agreement and possibly red line versions that hopefully went back and forth between the attorneys. Usually if you have more drafts and red lines that could indicate more of a negotiated fair agreement, and also clients reviewing it several times. So if someone is saying, I've never seen this document, like I don't remember it, I don't remember the terms, like you're going to be looking for the number of drafts. So those are, also the timing. When was the first draft given to Christine's attorney? When, email correspondence between the attorneys, phone calls, on billing records, so you're going to be looking for all of those, types of things, which you would get through discovery. And as you mentioned, Ryan, they just did depositions, so the attorneys are also another discovery tool that you're going to be doing is you are going to be taking depositions of the parties and, some various people. From your perspective, what are some other depositions that you could think of that would be useful, in this situation?
Well, certainly the attorneys that were involved at the kind of the negotiation, paralegals, notaries, anyone, that if she had a therapist or she had some sort of, her sister or her mom, anyone that Christine may have mentioned, I feel really forced or, they were confiding in that person. And that is why you would really want to dissect the attorney file because if her attorney was sending her emails and had that in the file, or if their billing statement showed that there was multiple phone calls and, but the attorney file. And really, I think it's helpful for listeners to understand what the courts often will do is have a hearing on whether or not the agreement is valid or not. Because after that, and we've seen this in news reports by Kevin Costner, is that she's asking for all this information on his new business ventures. There's some new series or documentary or some movie that he's working on, and they're saying we want all the information related to that. And Kevin Costner is saying that doesn't even matter because under the premarital agreement, that's mine, and you don't get any part of that. So the value is really immaterial. So when you have a premarital agreement that has business valuations or the value of property, you're not even getting into what really the value or the importance of that if there's a valid separation or valid premarital agreement. And so you first get into, is the agreement valid or not? And that's where these parties are at. And so there would be, an examination by her. Tell us at your deposition, who did you tell that you felt pressured? You said you didn't understand it. Well, let's look, Miss Baumgartner, let's look at the billing statement and these emails from your attorney. What did you not understand? Your attorney is explaining this to you. And that's why they're so fact specific. And, the notary, for people that, may not understand, like a notary ensures that someone is who they say they are in terms of signing it. But you mentioned videos. Oftentimes, these premarital agreements now are videotaped. And the point or the reason is that it shows that someone was voluntary. So, were they crying when they signed it? Or were they, laughing about, how it will never come to a divorce? And, like that really can matter.
Yeah, and also video recordings can show you, we've had certain cases where there's an allegation that, financial disclosures weren't attached to a document, also can show you and prove, what actually, like what documents were present at the signing.
Right, and so, Amy, the calculus by Baumgartner is that she's had to have, some sort of calculation or discussion by her attorneys that, she's trying to get more than $1.5 million. I think that's important because, if she was to get 0, there no property. That is different than obviously $1.5 million. I mean, if he's worth 400 million, well, that's obviously, not even it's a drop in the bucket for him. But when parties have a clear expectation and there's money on the table and there's a negotiation, how they arrived at the 1.5, was that just suggested by Kevin Costner and his attorney at the time in 2004? Or was it originally 1, but then she asked for 2 and then they landed at 1.5? That how they arrived at the 1.5 really matters. But Amy, reportedly there's a prevailing party attorney's fee provision in the agreement. And now there's no Colorado case law on that sort of provision, but for listeners that may not understand, what potentially does that mean for the, end result in this challenge?
Yeah, so what we're talking about is in a premarital agreement, parties can contract and there's usually a provision where it says that if you contest the validity or the enforceability of the premarital agreement, and if you lose, you have to pay attorney's fees, not just yours, but also your soon to be ex spouses. Another provision in there can be that, it can be a negotiation point that a party files for divorce, that the moneyed spouse pays for the attorney's fees during the divorce or an initial retainer. But Ryan, what you're talking about is, like it's essentially a penalty clause, I guess I would look at it. It deters someone from just, like filing motions with the court to say that I don't like this agreement anymore. There's a penalty, a monetary penalty saying, you entered this agreement, there's certain ways that they're invalid and not enforceable, but you better be sure of that. Otherwise, you're going to be paying your own attorney's fees and your spouse's.
Yeah, and here in Colorado, we have intermarriage of Eichler, and it stands for the proposition that if there's a waiver of attorney's fees, so the premarital agreement says each party pays their own attorney's fees at the time of the divorce. And, fast forward, like Kevin Costner and Baumgartner, they're going through a divorce here in Colorado. Well, he has there's such a disparity in the financial circumstances that the public policy militates in favor of people having legal counsel, and they shouldn't be penalized because they don't have as much money in this circumstance. So Kevin Costner would pay for her reasonable attorney's fees under the Eichler case, even if there was a waiver. But, the prevailing party attorney's fees, the court might say, your a reasonable amount would have been $10,000 for you to kind of have this divorce and to negotiate child support, for example, or some other aspects, maintenance. And, in Colorado, maintenance, there's a kind of a release on maintenance, which we can maybe talk about. But in this context, it has yet to be determined whether or not, if her attorney's fees, or rather, if Kevin Costner's attorney's fees were, let's say, $200,000, whether that's going to come out of the 1.5 that she would have received. I have seen premarital agreements that gives a certain time to the other party to either accept and agree that the agreement is valid. And if they do so, then they get a particular amount. And so it's this kind of incentive. So she would get $1.5 million so long as she doesn't contest it. And she's got 30 days or 60 days to make that decision. But people can, they can go into these sorts of negotiations, and it's a calculated risk. In Colorado, what we oftentimes see, Amy, is people will say, because of the Eichler case and the Newman case, which basically says that maintenance and spousal support, even if the premarital agreement says that it's not, that there's no spousal support, that is going to be, not enforced by the court. And so maintenance can be set as if there was no maintenance provision. Oftentimes what we see is Christine Baumgartner, that person, that party would say, I'm not challenging the premarital agreement. I'm just going forward on Colorado law. And it says that I can get attorney's fees and I can get spousal support. And so it's kind of walking that tight line between, calling into question the agreement while at the same time not challenging the validity and potentially having prevailing party attorney's fees.
Yeah, I think one other interesting, I guess, discovery issue related to the Costner divorce and the premarital agreement is confidentiality. So apparently there's a confidentiality agreement, and Kevin Costner's attorneys are arguing that, there are certain documents that are confidential that Christine is, that not, is not able to, have because of confidentiality. So Ryan, what is, your take on, if you had a case like that where the parties entered a confidentiality agreement, how do you navigate the confidentiality issue?
Well, the first thing that strikes me is how ironic is, because we've gotten all this information about what is all going on in the Kevin Costner divorce. So for them, it seems as if there is no confidentiality because we seemingly get the blow by blow and find out how much he's making from Yellowstone. I mean, he made like 16 or $16.8 million or something like that last year. But really, the confidentiality provision and the concern, if Kevin Costner says, listen, I'm working on a project, I can't give you information because it's confidential, then we have protective orders where, people will agree that they can't disclose to the news or some other, provision. But we see this all the time where, premarital agreements and these high net worth individuals and celebrities, they really value their privacy and their confidentiality for, good reason. So, we have seen, those issues in several cases, in many cases actually, that we work on. Anything else that I may have missed, Amy?
No, I think that's good. One other interesting provision, we're talking about celebrities that people ask is, like a anti-cheating provision valid within a premarital agreement? And I'm pretty sure it's universal that those are against public policy.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think that, there are these morality clauses, and so you can have contractual provisions where I do think are enforceable where, for example, if there are children that you get the marital house. And the idea makes sense, right? Like if someone's going to give up their career or they're going to, provide something, motherhood or fatherhood, parenting, that they get something. But generally speaking, if it says that, that if there's anti-cheating or there's some sort of incentive for divorce, those generally are unenforceable. But, the reality, Amy, is that there's not that much case law here in Colorado compared to other states. So we use these other states as kind of examples, and California and New York have, a robust, body of case law. And, we're working on, a book. I am on these issues because for me, I think it's really fascinating how Colorado, we just don't really have that much guidance from other states.
Yeah. So that was just kind of interesting. But to, wrap everything up, essentially, discovery is very important when it comes to contesting or defending a premarital agreement. And so we're hopeful that, we highlighted some of those interesting issues within, the Costner divorce.
Yeah, and I really hope for both of them, those people, that they're able to kind of move on, because I mean their lives are just being dissected. People are making judgments on, that she's asking for this amount, and it's unfortunate to see it, get so messy, but it does happen. It happens in particular on premarital agreements. They are often challenged, and knowing when and how to defend them or attack them is something that really is kind of an art and science, because there is some law, and as I mentioned, there are various arguments that can exist on both ends. So, but thanks for joining us on Divorce at Altitude.